Hi, hello. Welcome to your Unit 1 set of videos. Please make sure that you know exactly what homework format you need to use, and go ahead and get started. Alrighty, my friends, welcome back. Our topic for this video today is social classes and women in Mesopotamia. All right, and this is video number 4 in our unit. So what are our main objectives, right? We have 3 of them. The first one, when should world history start, right? That's answering our class unit theme. But I would also venture to say that not only is this a when question, but also where and with what, right? With what should history start, right? Should it start with land? Should it start with people? Should it start with social classes, etc.? Okay. Number 2, how did Mesopotamia create and use social classes to their advantage? And lastly, number 3, how did the role of women shift once Mesopotamia was an established area? And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with social classes. So agriculture enabled groups to accumulate wealth, and distinctions between the more and the less wealthy started to appear. And this technically started in various Neolithic villages, but it was incredibly more prominent as humans were evolving, specifically, right, for Mesopotamia. And the idea of cities themselves provided more opportunities for the accumulation of wealth because you have all these new different types of professions, specifically with trade from various areas. Social distinctions in Mesopotamia became much more sharply defined than those in the Neolithic villages. I already mentioned that. In early Mesopotamia, the ruling classes consisted of kings and nobles who won their positions because of their valor and successes as warriors. Early kings of the Sumerian cities made such a deep impression on their contemporaries that legends portrayed them as offsprings of the gods, right? And we've already seen this with our look at Hammurabi. Large-scale construction projects ordered by kings and lavish decorations for their capital cities reflected the high status of the Mesopotamian ruling class. And that ruling class, right, was closely allied with the priests and priestesses. Yes, there were men and women, because this was primarily binary worlds, were very close in touch with the ruling class. And many of them were actually the relatives of these rulers. The principal role of these priests and priestesses was to intervene with the gods, right? To talk to them, to try to interpret what the gods are saying, to ensure good fortune for their communities. In exchange, the priests and priestesses lived in temple communities and received offerings of food, drink, clothing from the general populace, right? So the whole entire job of these priests and priestesses is to be able to communicate, right, one-on-one with the gods. And by having this super awesome, big power, they were given all these accommodations. Okay? But temples also had many different purposes as well. They not only, were able to talk to the gods and goddesses, but they also generated income from the various lands that they owned. They would cultivate food, right? They would herd sheep and goats. They would manufacture various goods as well. Sometimes they were banks, sometimes there are orphanages, sometimes they're providing for the sick and the poor, etc. Right? They were basically kind of everything. And you have this image right here that kind of really shows and encapsulates exactly what temples were all about, right? Even though in this picture, for example, it's being still developed at the very, very top, it's big, it's massive. And this is essentially the center hub, I would venture to say, for the whole entire community, as opposed to the palace. Have the upper ruling classes, right? But now you have the more or less privileged classes that consisted of the free commoners, the dependent clients, and slaves. So the free commoners mostly worked as peasant cultivators in the countryside on land owned by their families. Some also worked in the cities as builders, craftsmen, or just various professionals like engineers, for example. Dependent clients, and it's kind of in the name, right? They had fewer options than the free commoners because they possessed no property, which means they were dependent on someone else for their living situation, for their food situation, etc. They usually worked as agricultural laborers on estates owned by others, and they owed a portion of their production to the landowners. And this idea is incredibly important. It's going to be key, especially as we go later down our various units, because this idea will never go away. Free commoners and dependent clients all paid taxes that supported the ruling classes, the military forces, and the temple communities. Then you have our last category of slaves. And slaves, there was three main sources for slaves, okay? There's the prisoners of war. So if you were, fighting, got captured, whatnot, you were automatically a slave. Perhaps you are a convicted criminal, where instead of being sentenced to death, you were sentenced to servitude. And then lastly, the heavily indebted individuals who essentially sold themselves into slavery because they couldn't pay X, Y, and Z, right? They couldn't satisfy their obligations. Some slaves worked as agricultural laborers on estates of noblemen's, supposed to say noblemen, sorry, or temple communities, but most were domestic servants in wealthy households. And in the end, many masters would grant slaves their freedom, often with a financial gift after several years of good behavior, good service, etc. And this is kind of just a nice little summary of our social structure. We're going to be looking at a lot of there he is. We're going to be looking at a lot of triangles in this at least semester, right? And this is our first triangle where you have the king, right, at the very top. And usually the king also incorporates the priests and priestesses. Right below them are the noblemen. And then right below the noblemen are the majority, right, the commoners, whether they are free commoners or dependent ones. And then lastly, the minority, or one of the minorities, I should say, is the slave population. So next, we're going to go ahead and transition to the patriarchal society. So Mesopotamia also built this patriarchal society, which essentially gave legal authority over public and private affairs to adult men, right? So whatever law was being created, whatever rule wanted to be established in the home, it had to be authorized by the men in the society. Within households, men decided the work that the family members did and also made marriage arrangements for their children as well as anyone else that were kind of under their authority. Men mostly dominated public life. They ruled as kings the majority of the time. And the decisions about policies and public affairs rested almost entirely in men's hands. And a big part of this idea comes from Hammurabi's laws that, once again, we've looked at before. And it throws considerable light onto sex and gender relations. So within his laws, he recognized that men were the heads of their households. And because they were the heads of their households, they were entrusted with all major family decisions. And everyone had to go to the male of the household for their various decisions. Men also had power to sell their wives and children, yikes, into slavery to satisfy their debts if they had any. And to protect husbands' reputations and legitimacy of their offspring, right, of their children, Hammurabi's laws suggested a death penalty for adultery, meaning if a woman, for example, if a wife during this time has an affair with another individual, that is adultery, right? Or has some sort of sexual relationship with another individual. They could be sentenced to death by drowning, according to Hammurabi's law. However, though, it wasn't the same thing for men. Men were allowed to engage in sexual relationships with concubines, which are essentially just like second, third, fourth, fifth wives, slaves, or prostitutes without any penalty whatsoever. And I would say this point of the reputation and legitimacy of their offspring is the key driving factor in all of this. So during the second millennium BCE, men progressively started to tighten their control over the social and sexual behavior of women. And once again, it's to protect their family, specifically now fortunes, right? Their money that their family has made throughout the generations, but also, once again, is guaranteeing the legitimacy of heirs in Mesopotamia. And this is where the first ideas of insisting on women being virgins, right? Right at the start of their marriage, right? They can't have sex until they get married. It also forbade casual socializing between married women and men outside of their families, because that was seen as a threat, right? The woman might just automatically go off and just have this wild night with this other man, right? Instead of putting trust into their counterparts. By 1500 BCE, upper class women had begun to wear veils when they ventured beyond their own households to discourage the attention of men from other families. And this idea is incredibly interesting because the concern of trying to control women in their social and sexual lives and behaviors spread throughout much of Southwest Asia, the Mediterranean area, which I would say is pretty much modern day Middle East, as well as Northern Africa. And these practices are still in place, right? From all the way to BCE times. Pretty astounding what humans, want to keep close to them. But I can't just spout patriarchy, blah, 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 without actually talking about women and women's roles and what some of them were able to do and not do. Right? I focus on what they were unable to not do, but let's look at how some women tried to make some sort of influence in their Mesopotamian society. At the ruling court center, at the very tippy top, sometimes women were able to advise kings and their various governments, right, by giving them their suggestions, perhaps their experiences, perhaps saying, like, hey, let me go to this location, tell you what I see, and I'll come back and give you information. There were a few high priestesses, right? And they were able to manage enormous estates, right? Enormous pieces of land that belonged to the temple, which means they got a lot of money. And others were able to have a formal education. And let me tell you, back in this day, Mesopotamia, a formal education meant that you were able to perhaps read cuneiform, for example, read and write it. Perhaps you were given some sort of early basic math, but otherwise that was it. Okay? But also many women were able to work as scribes. And scribes are literate individuals who prepared administrative and legal documents for governments and private parties. But I would say the majority of women pursued careers as midwives, as shopkeepers, as brewers, bakers, tavern keepers, and textile manufacturers. But there are a couple of exceptions of women who were the authority, right? Who were the queens of various lands throughout Mesopotamia. And we're going to look at one called Kubaba. I believe that's how you pronounce her name, Kubaba. Wow, what a gal that you see here. She is the only queen that has been recorded to reign for 100 years, according to, I believe it's called the King's Script. So a very, very long script of like a list of all the kings that ruled throughout Mesopotamia. It stated that she ruled for 100 years, whether that's true or not, right, remains to be seen. And this data came around 2,500 to 2,330 BCE. It is written that before she became a monarch, she used to be a brewess, right? She used to be a woman who made a bunch of ale and beer and whatnot, which is pretty cool. But unfortunately, there's actually not that much information about how she actually ruled, per se. We have this indication, for example, right up here in this quote that kind of shows you how she could have been a ruler or like what she could have done, but there isn't that much information recorded about her. But what is very interesting is that that there are many shrines in her honor that spread all throughout Mesopotamia, making her into a goddess. So she went from breweress to queen, and then once her sons, because she had sons after her, came into power, she was essentially deified, right? And became this goddess, and she was associated with being a motherly goddess figure, which is pretty cool. And that, my friends, is where we're going to end our video for today. So really quickly, what do we learn? Guess what? Humans are still complex. Wait, what? I know. Social classes are created through wealth and how much you have, right? Wealth. And lastly, Mesopotamian men created a sense of urgency to try to protect their family purity, right? The men's side of their family by restricting the rights of women. Wow, what a fantastic, invigorating, insightful, productive, wonderful video that Miss I has created for you. Yes, I know, you can go ahead and clap for me. It's totally fine. Please make sure that you have completed whatever homework format I have asked and given to you for this video, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Goodbye.